Books make you hope. Books make you dream. Books make you laugh. Books make you scream. This is the Books That Make You show, discussing books with authors and experts, unraveling the inner pages of all the books that help make us who we are.
Welcome to the Books That Make You show. I'm your host, Desiree Duffy, and we're talking about books that make you lie inside a shallow grave alongside immersive investigative journalist and true crime author Doug Kari. True crime stories, they're among the most riveting. They're often filled with mystery and, of course, real victims that we can't help but feel an emotional pull toward. And to, in some small way, understand and be able to empathize with their experience and give authenticity to readers. Well, being a true crime author takes a very balanced and unique skill set. And that's where Doug Kari comes in. He is the man who exposed the Berman Murders. It's the story of Barry Berman, heir to the Kahlua fortune. Yeah, you know that stuff you put in coffee? That one. And his wife, Louise. They went missing in 1986 in Saline Valley, which was a popular Mojave Desert draw for nudists and eccentrics. Oh yeah, this plot thickens. Now, Doug brings in this blend of scholarly research and some good old-fashioned storytelling. He believes in immersive investigation, and that has led him to lie inside of those shallow graves. That way he could envision the carnage that befell them just moments before their death. Now, he has scoured remote corners of Death Valley and uncovered clues. Not only that, but his true crime stories have run on the front pages of LA Weekly, Las Vegas Review Journal, San Francisco Daily Journal, and many other respected outlets. He has an English major from UC Berkeley, and Doug has honed his writing skills under novelist and professor Leonard Michaels, the Men's Club. Now, after receiving his law degree from UC Law in San Francisco, Doug practiced IP law while doing some pro bono wilderness protection work for Desert Survivors, which is an outdoor group that he co-founded. So I'll learn about that. But first, Doug, welcome to the show. I want to learn about the Berman Murders.
Well, thanks, Desiree. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, give us the big overview here. Tell us how the heir to the Kahlua fortune went from his father, this posh Beverly Hills lifestyle, to following this spiritual guru in the desert. Give us the lowdown.
Well, I think in short, he was just born that way. He marched to the beat of a different drummer in a time period in the 1960s when there were a lot of people marching to the beat of a different drummer. And he just wasn't drawn to the wealth and power of his father's world. And he decided to go a different direction. And ultimately, that direction, if you play it out over time, led him into this remote area of the Mojave Desert, where he and Louise disappeared, vanished without a trace.
Okay. I want to get into a little bit of your immersive storytelling and your techniques, because that's fascinating. But can you unpack some of the, and I know we need to read the book, so we can't unpack everything, but can you talk a little bit about when you're investigating it, some of the things that you found out?
Well, one thing I found out was where they were buried, which presumably is very close to or the location where they were killed. It wasn't easy. I needed to take information that the detectives had developed years earlier and translate those onto maps and figure out where this occurred. And that was a challenge in and of itself. And then once I arrived at the scene and I realized, okay, this is the grave, then I needed to switch gears from trying to find it in the first place to trying to understand and feel what took place there. And that's what led me to lie down in the grave, because I wanted to get inside it and look up at the sky and imagine that in this spot, literally in the middle of nowhere, this awful crime occurred, and to picture what that might have meant. and all the terrible things that may have happened there, that bad energy that came down in that spot.
I think that's what really sets you apart, Doug. And there's lots of true crime writers out there, journalists, podcasters. It as a genre is very popular. Folks love to be a sleuth from the couch and dig into it and try to figure it out. But you take it to this level of really getting into the perspective of somebody who's gone through something like that. How does it feel to be this type of an immersive storyteller?
Well, you feel a lot of emotions, Desiree, when you go through this process as a writer, because as you know, when you get into any artistic form, you have to open yourself. You have to open your senses and try to feel things that you wouldn't necessarily feel on a day-to-day basis. And that can include things like sadness, fear, elation, and the emotions that people go through as they investigate and get into the depths of a crime. I learned a lot about these folks as people, talking to their friends. I sort of relived the tragedy with some of their friends, and then I went out there into the desert on my own to feel what happened there and to understand what happened there.
And that leads into, it's been said that you don't trade your credibility for clicks or impressions because you're delivering something that is real. The accounts are as real and genuine as they can get.
Yeah, that's very true. At the same time, I want to make the point, I'm in this because it's absolutely fascinating, and these are stories that need to be told. But at the same time, I can choose to tell it in a shallow, exploitative kind of a way, just to try to emphasize the salacious details. Or I can let all those gory details just speak for themselves and tell the story in a more immersive and real way, and really try to understand and peel back the layers of what happened and why. And that's what I like to do. Not just, okay, these things happened, these bad things happened, but why? What underlay all this? What did the victims do that brought them to that point? And what did the perpetrator do that brought him to that point? And then how did these come together and result in a double murder in a beautiful place in this wonderful desert location? How in this desert location did it happen that this event occurred?
And you were able to convince the sisters of the chief suspect to reveal some rather intimate and even disturbing details about their brother. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, they say blood is thicker than water. And even though they believe that their brother has done terrible things, that doesn't necessarily mean they want to cooperate with the journalist. I think it was because I just kept on it over time, kept coming back to them, kept publishing articles about the case, kept doing things that enhanced my credibility as a storyteller, that I think they reached a point where they felt, well, they want to contribute to the story and reveal what it is that they know as well. And we just finally started to connect. And when we did connect, they were just so generous in telling me things without filtering it, just to tell me the truth from their perspective, which I really appreciated.
Mm-hmm. And how about how the accusers, how did you feel? There was a moment where the accusers of the chief suspect stood boldly before the court in his child assault cases. Yeah. And many, many years later, they were able to speak their truth. You were there for that. Tell us about that.
Desiree, I got into the story because of the unsolved double homicide in the desert. But as somebody who loves stories, when you get into a real life story where you don't control what the story is, you just follow it wherever it goes. And in this case, the person who is identified as the chief suspect was also somebody who ended up committing horrific sex crimes. And as I dove into that aspect of it and learned about it, that, of course, got me involved in attending the trial where these victims came forward. And it was just riveting, Desiree, to see people who had been abused as children by this terrible person come forward as dignified young women and tell their story in a courtroom, by the way, where the judge was a woman, where the prosecutor was a woman, where the chief defense lawyer was a woman. So here's this man who had victimized females being both judged and defended by women. I just found that to be remarkable and perhaps something that would only occur in this century.
Oh, absolutely. In this time and this space, and for it to be, I mean, that's poetic. That's what you think of when you hear the cliche poetic justice.
Right? Isn't it? I mean, it was, there was something just so synergistic about that event and watching it occur. Yeah. So that's also something that I reveal in the book, because I was there in the courtroom watching this go down, and I had really unequaled, unparalleled access at the various levels of these proceedings. Again, by sticking with it for so long, I was able to get people to open up to me. I was the only outside observer in the courtroom at the time that the verdicts came down. Because of the COVID lockdown, I sent a letter to the judge pleading to be able to be there, saying, I've been in this story. I need to tell this story. This is a matter of public interest. And she let me come into the courtroom and sit facing the defendant at the time that judgment was rendered.
It makes me think of, I mean, this is really one of those power shift moments, when power shifts. And again, when it comes to storytelling, when all of a sudden the tables turn on the villain in the story, that's that moment, right? But there seems to be a little bit of a through line with a lot of the stories and the story and others that you've investigated too, because there's a certain amount of power that comes when you have wealth, when you are part of certain systems, when you have privilege. Can you talk a little bit about some of the more unspeakable things that some people can do with their wealth and privilege in a world that sometimes looks the other way?
Well, let's use this case, the Berman case, as an example. So you've got this perpetrator who, at a certain point in his life, decides he's going to go to Asia, to an impoverished country, to Cambodia, to be specific, and set up, as you indicate, a life of privilege and power with a villa and pictures on the wall of himself with the king and the former prime minister. And he's going to bring in these sex slaves, these young girls, and victimize them. And he is going to be the dominant one, the powerful one, doing whatever he wants, having complete control. Imagine that same man now sitting at defense table with marshals hovering nearby as one of these young victims comes in, now a dignified young woman who, by the way, has learned to speak English beautifully, and comes in and very matter-of-factly tells her story. I mean, you could have heard a pin drop in that courtroom. It was very emotional, very powerful. And I felt privileged to witness that. And I felt privileged to be able to capture that in the book and deliver it to the reader, because that's the kind of moment you don't necessarily see a lot of in this world, where somebody goes from being completely powerless and victimized to being a person who now has the opportunity to use the truth as a weapon back against the person who did this.
It gives one a little bit of faith that maybe there is such a thing as karma and cosmic justice and all of that.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned karma, because Barry and Louise were disciples of an Eastern Indian guru, a Punjabi guru, and they believed in karma as an absolute law. So if you look at it that way, and you look at it from their perspective, absolutely, this was karma in action. And that overlay of thinking of their belief system and their belief in karma, and then seeing this perpetrator who had gotten away with so much for so many years, suddenly having his own actions turned back on him, revealed in open court, and then for judgment to be rendered on that basis. it was, again, the synergy of that with the desert murders and then these later crimes, somehow it all tied together. That was another thing that I wanted to deliver for the reader. Here you have two separate situations, yet they're not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it all came full circle. Fascinating. The Berman Murders is this book that we're talking about. And I know you've got other things in the work, and you have many cases that you're covering. Can we hit on some of the other ones and get the high notes on some of your thoughts? Like, we'll start with Kari Gus, for example.
That's what I was going to pick. So I've been on that story since she disappeared in 2018. Just to step back for a second, we're talking about, again, a rural area in eastern California, really closer to Nevada than California, nothing like the California coast. And this girl who had kind of a troubled night, had a bad drug experience, now she wakes up, it's a fresh new day. She's 16 years old. She goes on a walk in her neighborhood. A neighbor sees her looking up, looking at the sky as the sun's coming up. She walks down near the highway, Desiree, and she's never seen or heard from again. Now, I'm not talking a major road with thousands of cars going by. I'm talking Highway 6 in Eastern California early on a Saturday morning. Very few cars passing by, maybe a few truckers. We have no idea what happened to her. No clue has emerged. It's more than 5 years now. This is one of the most mysterious and troubling cases in the country right now in terms of a missing child, a missing person. And it's frustrating. The FBI is involved. Local authorities are involved. I've had very good access to the family. I was in the house not long after this occurred with access to her room, everything, interviewed with the parents. It's just, there's just no explanation here other than that possibility of either she disappeared deep into the desert and died and hid herself, or she was abducted. That's really what we're down to. Your choice, Terrible.
When you're in the room and you're doing this and get investigative immersive journalism like this, do you tend to see things or pick up on things that maybe law enforcement dismisses or other people don't necessarily consider?
I don't know if I'm any better than law enforcement or anybody else, but I'll tell you one thing I do that I think is very important is before I go in, and I was driving up to their house and I knew I was going to be sitting down with people who potentially, of course, are going to be looked at as suspects, right? Parents say, oh, our child disappeared. So I just needed to take a moment as I was driving to look out at the desert and think for a moment. You're about to go into a room in a house where you don't know what happened there. And so wipe away your preconceived notions and just be open to whatever it is you see and feel. No preconceived notions, and just gather those pieces in and see where it leads. And just keep looking and see where it leads. The problem in the Kari Gus case is it leads to a dead end down there by the highway. That's where the dogs lost the scent. When they had the search dogs go out, they lost the scent by the highway. And I have to think maybe she got in a car.
Sounds like it. It
Right?
really does. Yeah.
Yeah.
What
But
about?
I was going to say, Desiree, it is very powerful when you go from just thinking about something and it's a little bit hypothetical to actually being in the room with two people whose child was abducted. Like, that's where true crime becomes real. You're in there. These are real people sitting across the table. You click on a tape recorder, you start taking notes, you start asking questions. That's a powerful moment in and of itself.
What a horrific thing to go through, but then what a great thing to have somebody like you, and of course, law enforcement and others, the FBI, everybody, the community, a lot of times, takes up, as much as possible to help in those searches and do what they can. And even people outside of the realm, it seems that in the true crime world, that crowdsourcing can sometimes lead to clues and to things being uncovered that folks that are right there in it might not necessarily see.
The participatory nature of true crime is really interesting. With another case that I'm working on right now, I've been wading through all of the social media that surrounded the case. It was in this case, the murder of Naomi Irion in northern Nevada, the abduction and murder of Naomi Irion. As the case was being worked through, a lot of people were participating. There were a lot of good ideas that were coming in from this crowdsourcing, a lot of good thoughts. And one thing that the good law enforcement does now is they don't just discount all of that. They don't say, oh, what do these folks know? They look through it, they separate the wheat from the chaff. But if somebody has a good idea, a good tip or a lead, the good law enforcement agencies follow up. Why not, right? Why not?
Yeah. Okay, what about let's touch on some of these other cases too, because it's just so intriguing. The Mormon moms, what happened there in Mexico?
Well, that goes back to a little bit of early history, Wild West history, when the LDS Church decided it was no longer going to embrace polygamy, and there were some breakaway colonists who then went down into Mexico and started a couple of different colonies. Where they still permitted polygamy and very much embraced polygamy. Fast forward till now, there is still polygamy being practiced in some of these colonies, and then some of the people don't practice polygamy. It's not required, but there still is polygamy going on. One of those colonies is in Sonora State. It's called La Mora, and it's a beautiful spot. They're very successful in farming, particularly pecan trees, and there are a number of people who live down there. Generally, they have dual citizenship, Mexican and U.S. citizenship. And there was a group in SUVs of moms and kids who were going to head up this dirt road in a remote part of northern Mexico and then cross into the United States. And they were ambushed by cartel gunmen and shot to pieces. So imagine moms and kids, even babies, being shot up in SUVs. Horrific. There was international attention paid to the incident. When I heard about it, I thought, this is my backyard. I want to investigate this. So I did.
What a story. And you've also gone to Mexico, the Mexico-U.S. border, and covered the Migrant Crisis. Tell us about that.
I have, yeah. So in Mexico, what I did is, again, it's my backyard. When that first migrant caravan was coming from Central America, a lot of attention being paid to this whole event. What I did is decide I'm going to dive in and see what's going on. So I crossed the border into Mexico. I've got a working knowledge of Spanish. I teamed up with a colleague down there who was just more familiar with the terrain and with the dynamics, could kind of watch my back as I was interviewing people. And again, I got in there and went into the migrant camps, interviewed people. And in fact, there was one moment that I'm rather proud of. Chris Cuomo from CNN arrived, and he was, I don't know, probably a few hundred yards away with a big entourage. And it was at that moment that I was lying in the mud taking photographs of a toddler who was playing, and it was a particularly poignant moment to see this toddler playing with trash in the mud, and it resulted in some of the best photos I think I've ever taken. Again, a willingness to just literally lie in the mud to try to capture the moment.
Your photography is excellent, by the way, too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I try. Yeah. iPhones are amazing things, right? They can even make those of us that may not have a lot of skill or knowledge take decent photos. And I work it. I work it. I really try.
What do you think your grandmother would say or think if she was looking back at you? She was a big inspiration in your life. Can you talk about her?
My grandmother was amazing. After my grandfather died in 1957, she decided out of the blue to move from the San Francisco Bay Area to a little artist's cabin in the middle of the Mojave Desert. She witched a well for water. She had kerosene lamps for light. She loved to collect plants, and she planted a beautiful garden. She surrounded herself with relics, and she said that she could talk to rattlesnakes and she could sense valuable minerals. And that's how she lived her life, was as a prospector in the desert. You can imagine, as a boy growing up, we go and visit grandma. Oh my gosh, I was completely taken by it, and learned how to drive a four-wheel drive when I was still young and go out into the desert and hike. That's how I really got introduced to it, and why I fell in love with the desert and became involved in desert exploration. And that's also provided me kind of a role model to follow. That gave me a framework to build from, was looking at her and the choices that she made. So as you probably noticed with my work, I kind of look for stories in that area, ranging from northern Mexico up through Nevada, eastern California, up into parts of Idaho, Montana, Utah, that Great Basin and Mojave and Sonora desert areas are where I go look for stories.
Can you tell us about Desert Survivors, the outdoor group that you co-founded?
Yeah, the name was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, Desiree, because this was in college. We went on an exploration trip that turned into a hiking trip, hiking into a mountain range that we really had no business being in. We weren't that well prepared. We didn't understand what it's like to do higher altitude desert mountaineering. And we ended up overdue, I would say. We were supposed to come back and meet our friends on a Saturday morning. We didn't actually come off the mountain for several more days, by which time they had gone and reported us missing to authorities. So that was a kind of almost a coming of age experience for me, learning how to survive in the desert. And so my friend Jim Morrison and I decided we were going to call ourselves Desert Survivors and start a desert exploration and conservation group under that name. And then we got very involved in the desert wilderness protection movement of the late 80s, early 1990s.
Okay. Tell us what we can look forward to next, or tell us what you can tell us, because I know you're working on some things you might not be able to reveal too much.
Well, I mean, I can tell you that I'm doing a deep dive into the whole Naomi Irion case, which was the girl who was abducted and murdered in northern Nevada. I've published a couple of articles about it, but it's so fascinating to me. I've decided that I want to go deeper. So I've been doing a lot of work on that case, exclusive interviews, gathering information, records, everything. What I can tell you is that the fact pattern is just almost unbelievable. Imagine a 41-year-old man, a construction supervisor, successful, has a fancy pickup truck and a girlfriend and a 6-figure job, gets up one morning, goes to a Walmart, kidnaps a teenage girl who's waiting to go to work, brings her out into the desert to a pre-dug grave, then comes home at the end of the day and says, "Hi, honey, I'm home." I mean, who does that? No, seriously, who does that?
Right.
That's the question. That's the question I'm trying to answer. Who does that and why? And that's why I'm doing a deep dive. I felt this was so extreme that I wanted to understand what happened and why. Again, peel away the layers. I can tell you, lots of people have reported on the basic facts surrounding the case, but nobody else has gone and done the deep dive into his background and her background and understanding how is it that this happened. And that's my next big project that I'm working on.
You do take some deep dives, and I've read through some of the case studies that you've put together. And if folks want to kind of follow along, they can go to your website. You've got a newsletter, social media. Doug, can you give people your details? Let them know how they can find you in the book.
Sure, Desiree. First of all, I'm Doug, D-O-U-G, right? And then my last name's a little unusual. It's a Finnish name. My grandparents were Finnish immigrants, and my last name is K-A-R-I. So my website is dougkari.com. I'm at Doug Kari Author on Facebook and at Doug Kari Author on Instagram. And there's some good content up there. If you like true crime, there's some interesting stuff that I've got up there, some of which we've talked about, some of which we haven't. And then, of course, I've got a monthly newsletter and I blog. And so there's content there that you might find interesting. It's worth a quick read. Yeah.
Excellent. And your book is published by Rowman and Littlefield, so people can go to their website, plus find it on all the great bookstores, your local bookstore. You can go to Amazon as well. Doug, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. And you're right. We touched on maybe 4-ish, 5-ish of the cases that are in front of me. And I know you're even working on more. So there's a lot that folks can unpack with you, with Doug Kari. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been really fascinating.
Yeah, thanks, Desiree. It's a pleasure, truly, to talk about this, and I really appreciate the work you do in bringing these stories to your listeners and viewers. It's great.
Right back at you. Right back at you.
Yeah,
appreciate everything that you're doing and everything that you're doing to help get the voice, the victims, honoring them. I think that the way you approach it and what you do for them is really commendable. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Desiree.
And thank you, everybody, for being with us today on the Books That Make You show. You can find out more about us on our website. That is booksthatmakeyou.com. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and of course on YouTube. Make sure you ring the bell, subscribe, never miss a show. And also don't forget to subscribe to our Webby Award-winning Books That Make You newsletter. Until next time, all of my bookish buddies, please enjoy all of the books that make you exactly who you are.
The host and executive producer of the Books That Make You show is Desiree Duffy. Sound mastering and engineering by Dave Napox. Social media and content promotion by Siddhi Jahagirdar. Copywriting and editing by Mike Robinson. The Books That Make You show is an award-winning podcast produced by Black Chateau Enterprises.